Hello and welcome to the Hacking Safe podcast. This is your host, Alex Mershak. With me today is Charles Haywood. Charles Haywood is the maximum leader of the Worthy House, as well as the uh, writer of the Foundationalist Manifesto, The Politics of Future Past, and sort of the founder of Foundationalism. Charles, welcome to the show.
Pleased to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on. So you are well known, at least in your public image, for the Worthy House and the tremendous amount of reviews that you write. I have to say that it is enviable to be in a position where you seem to be spending a vast majority of your time reading, writing, and thinking. And so I congratulate you on your aristocratic achievement.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But I will say, I don't weirdly, now that I'm kind of semi-retired, I actually spend less time reading and writing than when I was working full time. I'm not sure what's up with that, but anytime someone calls me aristocratic, I am happy to accept the compliment.
I have one interesting question, and perhaps you've gotten it before. I listened to one of your previous interviews, but I was wondering, why are you the maximum leader?
Yes, this is actually a inside joke. Many years ago, when I was a lawyer at a Chicago law firm, I did mergers and acquisitions law for 6 or 7 years. I was a senior associate, junior partner, non-equity partner at that point, and I had a young lawyer I did a lot of work for, and I have a certain type of personality that's probably a bit more aggressive than the average lawyer. So this young lawyer who enjoyed working with me started calling me maximum leader, and so I just picked up the phrase from then. I regret to say I have not used it my entire life. I was just searching for a self-descriptor for the website when I started the website in 2015, 2016. And so therefore I picked maximum leader. But it's weird because all these people out there who don't like me or, for some reason or another have some animus against me. I mean, how could you have animus against me? I'm just such a charming, nice guy. But it's they think it's some kind of non-ironic statement of my intention to be, the next Kim Jong-un, only thinner. It's really not. It's really in a sense kind of meaningless, right? It wasn't meant to be anything, meant to be anything except a joke. But well, there you go.
Yeah, well, there is an interesting component to sort of the rhetoric of kind of the whole site, the way that it's put together. I don't doubt at all its seriousness, but it does come off as sort of fantastical in a way. Are you trying to cultivate that image?
No, not at all. I mean, I think this is one of the problems, not just with me, but in general with the right, or what I might call the serious right, as opposed to the provocateur right. Everything seems fantastical, but of course that's a historical commonplace, particularly in kind of the modern, post-Enlightenment era when ideology plays an important part in politics. Any change that is significant from an existing system, especially if it's new or new old, necessarily seems fantastical. And that's doubly or triply true in our current environment when we're bathed in continuous propaganda that tells us that the current system is the best ever and it's only going to get better as long as we give money and power to the select group of people who are special people who watch out for us, yada yada yada. So everything seems fantastical in a sense, but as it's only fantastical until it's not.
To the extent that your mind is kind of trapped in the liberal milieu that we're all bathed in.
Yes, exactly. And you saw that with the contretemps this week or last week with Tucker Carlson and Daryl Cooper. That is, people lost their minds when Cooper and Carlson suggested that which was their main point of their talk, that the accepted narrative of World War II, in the sense of it being used as a excuse or reason for pretty much every action that the regime takes today, the accepted narrative is wrong, and people lost their minds, but you're not allowed to say that the accepted narrative is wrong. It's just like saying the Martians started World War II. What are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly. So before we get into sort of the Foundationalist Manifesto, I want to understand a little bit more about you and your career trajectory. You do have this very interesting illustrious and fairly successful career. So you started out at the University of Chicago. You went into law. You were doing mergers and acquisitions, and then somewhere along the way, you started a hair products company. Can you tell me about that? What was the impetus behind that? Was that just a purely calculated move? Why did you end up going into that business?
Sure. But before I tell that, I'd just like to say this is my favorite podcast ever because within the first 5 minutes, I've been called both illustrious and aristocratic. So I hope we continue this this path. Oh, the answer is very simple. And the answer is that I wanted to be rich.
Hmm,
It had nothing to do with like some innate love of hair care. It just happened to be the business that I ended up in. The week before I started that business, I bid on the assets of a defunct concrete cutting business. So I could have been the concrete cutting guy rather than the hair care guy, though I doubt that would have been as successful as hair care was. Hair care, as it turns out, and manufacturing in general, this is contract manufacturing, as long as you maintain high margins, is infinitely scalable, which is much better than concrete cutting, which is not infinitely scalable. Don't go in. For anybody who is watching this should not go into concrete cutting and coring. It's a terrible business.
hmm,
I mean, I'm sure some people make money in it, but it's probably people with government or mob connections. I stopped being a lawyer and started being a business guy. I'd always had an interest in business, and I was in business law, mergers and acquisitions, as opposed to litigation. But I did it because I wanted to be rich, and being a lawyer makes you well-to-do, not rich.
hmm,
The most successful lawyers, other than plaintiffs' lawyers, various forms of extortionists like asbestos lawyers, who can become truly rich. Short of that, big firm lawyers who work for big companies as mergers and acquisitions lawyers don't become truly rich. They just become well-to-do, and they're still basically at the beck and call of somebody else. And true, anybody making money is, except in very rare instances, at the beck and call of somebody else to some degree.
hmm.
But as a lawyer, you're more at the beck and call of people than you are as a businessman. That said, I enjoyed being a lawyer. I had great clients. I enjoyed my law firm, though I'm sure that to the extent they ever, it was Foley and Lardner, now just called Foley, one of these giant law firms, and I'm sure that if they ever hear my name in association with them, they recoil like a vampire from garlic. But but that was a long time ago. So
Hmm,
I just went into hair care, to making shampoo, as I say. There was all kinds of hair care because I wanted the money. The
hmm.
end. Nothing more and nothing less.
So was it? I'm sorry to get into the grimy details, but I am
Oh, I
interested.
love
Like,
talking about this. This is great.
so was it that you just saw you were looking for depressed assets and it wasn't so much an industry analysis, or like I'm just curious, like how does one decide to buy? I assume you bought the factory.
Sort of. So the answer is that I can't claim any kind of wonderful, unique insight on my part. Like I say, I wasn't like I identified shampoo as a business. I just wanted a business. My
Hmm,
assumption was I could make any business make me rich,
hmm,
which that to be true, at least in the n equals one sense. Uh, so the answer, the longer form version of the story is that there was a local meaning Indianapolis, where I live, or I live in north of Indianapolis. It's a, a similar business had gone out of business because the founder had died and the widow and son had tried to run the business and basically bankrupted. I mean, technically it wasn't bankrupt, but the bank was auctioning the assets. So that the bank sold the assets of this basically shampoo company, which consists of filling machines and big tanks for mixing shampoo and things like that. The bank sold the assets for like $6 million.
hmm,
And I scraped together, because I didn't have any money at all. And my wife was pregnant with our second child, and we had no savings, and I had no job because I had quit my earlier job to look for a business to buy. I scraped together 40 or $50,000, and I bought a de minimis, that's lawyer speak for a very small amount, of the assets at this auction. So whatever percent 50,000 is of 6 million, that's the percentage of the factory that I bought. No
hmm.
customers, no place to put any of the equipment. My wife is like, well, where are you going to put this equipment? And I'm like, oh, I'll find a place.
Good pitch.
Well, I mean, my wife was very supportive. And
Hmm,
so, I found a place, and then I found a customer. And once you find one customer, it's the difference between zero and one customer. It's like the difference between having zero and one gun.
hmm.
You can have, it's like the marginal benefit of one of something sometimes is nearly infinite as opposed to zero. One
Yeah.
to two, not so much necessarily.
Hmm,
And so I just ran that for 15 years. I mean, by the end, it was pulling in 50 million a year at say 25% net margin. So, and I sold it off to Pritzker Private Capital, owned by
Mm,
J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, and his brother, who I
mm,
have not met and I don't think much of politically. But I must say, Pritzker Private Capital was a pleasure to deal with in terms of the transaction. So I have no beef with J.B. Pritzker on a business on a business side of things. So I sold that in 2020.
mm.
So there you
And then
go.
along the way, you started the Worthy House. Um, why did you start doing that? And I guess as an additional question on that is um, did you go into it with a specific political outlook, or was your political outlook shaped by the endeavor itself?
I went into it because I've historically read a fair amount, though for years I didn't, have the time to do it necessarily. But I was reading more, and I have a terrible memory. My father was a history professor of Russian history, 19th
Mm,
century Russian railways was a specialty, and he had a great memory, which I did not inherit. So, like a lot of people, I think, but maybe worse than a lot of people, I read a book now. A week later, I have no idea what was in the book, and I found that starting to write reviews helped fix things in my mind a little bit better. So initially, I just started writing short reviews on Goodreads and Amazon. And my wife was like, well, and they're very popular on Amazon. And at one
mm.
point, I was up to like the number 30 reviewer in the world
Wow.
until they deplatformed me and I
Mm,
sued them and lost, but that's a different story. And my wife is like, well, you should have a website. I'm like, yeah, website. No one wants to read my stuff that badly. But she prevailed, and so I did, and people were interested, and they got more interested. And then I did audio versions, which are which is just me reading things. And I have video versions of the audio of things as well. So it just grew on itself, and so I have what 600 or something articles, book reviews. The question about the politics, which is the chicken and the egg, is actually a good one. I would say that mostly my politics predate the Worthy House, but they have definitely been shaped and kind of honed and hardened through the writing. And you can see this. I mean, if someone were to be supremely bored and wanted to go back and read all of my stuff from early, you can see it's always been a very right wing website because
mm,
originally it was anonymous. I mean, I just used my first name because it wouldn't necessarily have been great for my opinions to be more widely known. But it's you see it more kind of you see it becoming, as I say, sharpened. I would say radicalized to a certain extent. Radicalized isn't necessarily exactly the right word, but
mm.
I think if you went back to 2015, you'd find me to be a more normie conservative, and if you go back even further, you'd find me uh, supporting George W. Bush, God rot him. And so I think things have changed over time. I don't think that's a unique arc. And I think if you read J.D. Vance's tweets, you see
Mm.
how the world has changed, right? So I think but I think the writing has definitely caused that to happen in the sense that, yeah, I might have different political views, but it's definitely more coherent. And I try not to repeat myself. So occasionally people ask me. So, for example, someone asked me the other day who studies at one of the military academies by email, like what would you recommend for people who to kind of convert people or introduce people to this way of thinking? And there's no great answer because it's meant to be a coherent whole, and I try not to repeat myself. I mean, yeah, there's some amount of repetition just for the nature of it, but I try very hard not to repeat myself. But that means that you can't just point to like this one thing is where everything is explained. And that's part of it's also true that I try very hard not to make it an ideology.
Yes.
The one secret thing that explains everything, and if it
Mm.
contradicts, if my secret knowledge, then you must be a bad person. I mean, it's not meant to be a closed system in the sense of
Yeah.
it explains everything.
So it's true that it's not intended to be an ideology, and you say so yourself. It's really a set of guiding principles that underlie the work, and in that sense, it is a living philosophy, in that it seems to it's vital, and it takes into account some degree of like discernment, and and accounting for uh the individual context and also temporal context.
Yes,
Um,
that's a great. I need to write that down. That's a great summary.
Well, thank you. I wanted to ask you about the six quotes. So you have six quotes that are appended to the bottom of every page on the site. They include Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Carl Schmitt, Thomas Paine, Ernst Jünger, Elvis Presley, Vladimir Lenin at the bottom as a real kicker. So I'm wondering, like, how did you choose those six quotes?
You are the first person who has ever asked about those quotes, and I think those quotes are actually very important. So, I know all I do is thank you and compliment you because this is apparently a back rubbing podcast. But those quotes encapsulate my not my political philosophy, because it doesn't really encapsulate foundationalism, but more it's like they encapsulate my approach to politics. So,
Mm,
for example, the Lenin quote, if I remember, is "timing is all," and the Junger quote, which is more obscure, is "Naglfar, the ship of the apocalypse, shifts into a calculable position."
mm,
So if you take the quotes as a whole, what they basically are meant to convey is, and you kind of touched on the word earlier, a feeling of vitality. That is, we're not here to sit around and read the great books and talk about how great it is that X, Y, and Z philosophers said ABC, and isn't that wonderful? And can I have another coffee? And let's talk about this and have a seminar. I'm not.
mm,
I'm here to win.
mm,
And winning can be defined in a variety of ways, but winning necessarily implies vitality in action. And all
mm.
of those quotes fundamentally boil down to all of those to that as a applied philosophy.
Mm. Excellent. Yeah. That's important to note because, that is one criticism of sort of the if you could call it the dissident right or the deep right, is that the the scene, if you could call it that, is too fixated on old books, basically. I talked to Lomez over at the Passage Press. He's doing a lot of great work. Um, and that there's not enough focus on pragmatic politics, policy per se. And this is a debate that I go back and forth with a lot of my friends on who are more policy minded. And I think part of the issue is that you need to be action oriented, and we should be leaning into strong action bias. But that doesn't necessarily mean working through the existing system as it is, or does it? What are your thoughts on sort of political action as such?
It's a great question because it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about things feeling fantastical. Political action now in the kind of end stage of a political system always seems like change is impossible to achieve through political action. And the reason it seems impossible is because it is within the current framework in
Hmm.
any meaningful way. And you see this repeatedly. I mean, but fundamentally, you see this in the fact that this uniparty exists that prevents any action that is not conducive to left hegemony and continued power and goals. This is not news, but it's obviously the case, and all the voting you want to do is never going to change that. And you see this most recently, for example, in the various publicity regarding migrants, none of which has actually resulted in change. It is true, of course, that voting for Trump is perceived as potentially changing that, but that's of course a fiction. Voting for Trump may in fact change this, but not because Trump or the Republican Party or whoever will be able to change anything, but because the advent of Trump will cause a fracturing of the system due to exposing its underlying contradictions and create actions by various parties that allow new things to break forth.
Hmm.
But so political action in the sense of voting doesn't actually do anything, with the kind of caveat that it can lead to other things. But political action in the sense of organizing, especially locally, but more generally in terms of creating groups of like-minded men and things like that to await the next thing that happens. And
Hmm.
you don't, people sometimes say, well, that's kind of pacifist or quietist, or what you really need to do is make the next step happen. But that's very difficult. I mean, there's no examples in history of the next step being made to happen by a bunch of randos in a dying polity. People may take advantage of something that happens externally
Mm,
when that breaks possibilities open, or something may happen that's kind of elite led. It doesn't have to be like elite led. You can have non-elite led changes, but there's really not much that, like, say, Charles Haywood or Alex Kershak can do with respect to taking action to change things in some meaningful way. You just have
mm.
to wait around and see when that opportunity arises to force something to be, I don't know, more move in a different direction. And so one of the things I'm doing now, I occasionally write very long form pieces where I don't just review one book, but read a lot of books on a particular topic. So, for example, I did the Finnish Civil War, I did the Spanish Civil War, Francisco Franco. I'm working now on the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, and I'm
Mm,
half Hungarian, so I have a particular interest in this. And so that you see that where you have basically people are sitting around all day long for 10 years or so after World War II in Hungary being oppressed, and there's nothing they can do about it. And
mm,
then one day, circumstances change, so they can do something about it. That's
mm.
fundamentally what I think political action should be directed at, enabling people to take actions that are more aggressive than they can take at the present moment when the
And,
right comes.
and so do you think it's more about being primed and ready to pounce on an opportunity as it presents itself, sort of quietly gathering power in the meantime, but in a way that's not directly adversarial to the system?
Yeah, I think that's, well, I mean, I'm directly adversarial to the system, but only verbally.
Right, right. In a way that the system you could say is, uh, would you say it's non-threatening?
Well, I mean, I don't particularly see myself as threatening, though I
Mm,
have no doubt I'm on a variety of lists, but no doubt those lists are also very lengthy. I doubt if my name is particularly prominent on any
mm.
list. You know, as they say, I'm a micro niche e-celeb, not
Yeah,
someone who's of particular importance. But yeah, so but definitely adversarial. I mean, I think the regime, which I define in great detail in some of my pieces. But I mean, the regime needs to be completely destroyed. And
mm,
I think that when that happens, there should be tribunals and people who large numbers of people should be sent to prison, their assets confiscated, exiled, and what have you. So I think that sounds pretty adversarial.
yeah, yeah,
But last I checked, Charles Haywood didn't have the power to do any of those things right now,
exactly.
and it's entirely possible. I'll cry that I'll never have the power to do any of those things, nor
Mm.
will anybody I see eye to eye with have the power to do those things. We will just see. That's just the way it is.
And this sort of takes me to another phrase that you've become sort of an exponent of, which is no enemies to the right. And this I think has to do with, uh, for one, I'll just say that there is this problem of a large number of people dedicating a tremendous amount of time to policing the acceptable boundaries of who is in the right and who can speak on behalf of the right and who we sort of allow to be part of the conversation.
Mhm.
Um, that being said, uh, in the future potential of some kind of power struggle where the regime is thoroughly destroyed and dismantled, there is this issue of secession and who are the ones who will replace them. And so my understanding of this phrase when you use it isn't that like, oh, there's no one on the right that you would find objectionable or reprehensible or whose views would not be misaligned with yours. Rather, that is of no concern in the meantime, so long as we're all under the same boot. Is that right?
That's correct. I use the phrase "no enemies on the right" because
Hmm.
to the right tends to, then you're like, well, who's to my right? Who's to my left? But on the right kind of thing. So no enemies on the right, I think is a better phrasing. But fundamentally, I have one goal, which is the total and cataclysmic and permanent defeat of the left and its discrediting for all time.
Hmm.
I like to say, I want leftist ideas to be thought of in the same way as people think of the ideas of Mithras today. That it's something from long ago that people who are alien to us did, and it's vaguely interesting, probably bad, but it was long ago, and none of those people are around anymore. So that's a tall order, to be sure, but certainly the left is doing its best to discredit itself. See, keeps popping back up, though. It's kind of sad. But so until that's done, that's all that matters. Nothing else matters in terms of political action. That said, it's kind of a truism that let's say we wake up tomorrow and the left has disappeared. God has decreed that no one may be left anymore, and so everybody, so the people who deny what God said have disappeared. Everyone else has converted. Nobody is on the left anymore. That doesn't solve. I mean, you still have enormous problems. Among them, well, simple governance structures, given that what we have now is not any kind of constitutional republic, but merely a leftist dictatorship, not dictatorship, oligarchical kleptocracy, but the structural problems, but you have also philosophical problems. I mean, fundamentally, one of the major problems facing America is, it's the same problem on multiple axes. Widespread lack of virtue and widespread divergence in concepts of what constitutes the good. And while the former can be solved largely by a restoration of virtue, probably through a religious awakening, and the elimination of the vast majority of people from any kind of direct hand in national politics, which only the ruling class should really have any hand in national politics. The fact is that I'm a big fan of Bronze Age pervert, right? I like Bronze Age pervert.
Yeah.
Not at all clear that Bronze Age pervert and I could run a government together in any meaningful way, because we have different conceptions of the good in many areas,
Right.
but that's a problem for future Charles. I don't know what that solution looks like. What it probably looks like is a devolution of as much power as possible to the local level. Because, so for example, Bronze Age pervert and I can agree that the national government should defend the borders. I mean, you very few people on the right who would disagree with that statement, and they would all fall into the kind of dumbass libertarian camp.
Yeah.
Defend your own borders, and
Right.
that's kind of unfair. But I don't think even libertarians think that. And so maybe the problem would solve itself to a certain extent if the national government basically was stripped down to something that only performed core and essential functions. Maybe you wouldn't have this kind of argumentation. But fundamentally, it's very difficult to run a successful society if there's too much divergence in the world outlook of the people in the ruling class, or even among the masses, but focusing on the ruling class. And that's a problem I don't really know how to solve, but there's no point in wasting time worrying about it, because what that will look like is impossible to say now. So why waste time on it? It becomes a form of wasted mental effort that could be better directed at using and defeating the left.
Exactly. So yeah, that's interesting. It's not quite a night watchman state, but it's something close.
Yeah, I mean, I like to say as a state of unlimited ends and limited means. Says the state should have unlimited means to pursue the national defense, for example. But it should have very limited ends. It should most things that the national government does now, 95% maybe, simply should not be done by the national government. So it's pretty close to a night watchman state.
So getting into foundationalism itself, it consists of two things. One is the renewal of society. And the second is sort of the long-term maintenance of society. These are two kind of distinct phases. You talked before about kind of the lack of virtue and coherent notions of the good in current American society. But your understanding of what renewal looks like isn't exactly a return of sorts. It is not, for example, deciding to transpose Greek virtue ethics exactly onto modern day, but it's sort of an accounting of them with a mix of a few other things. For example, you yourself are a Christian and believe that that part of this renewal would be the predominance or the reassertion of Christian cultural hegemony in the United States. So talk to me a little bit about uh, what are sort of the ground stakes for renewal. And then one just point of clarification, I guess, before we proceed too far into the discussion, is that when you talk about the total destruction of the left, which is sort of a prerequisite for any of this happening, you're talking about the left of the French Revolution, which has its own specific tenets, correct?
Correct, but I regard the left as fundamentally the philosophy of the Enlightenment, first
Mm,
brought kind of full flower in the French Revolution. But all leftism is fundamentally the same. I reject the idea that there are some forms of leftism that are distinct from other forms of leftism in any truly meaningful way.
mm. Okay, excellent. And the tenets of leftism are really that this getting rid of, unshackling of sort of the bounded human form, in a sense of emancipation, yes, in a sense of from circumstances which we did not choose.
Right. All bonds not continuously chosen.
Okay, excellent. So what does renewal look like in terms of restoring virtue and also common notion of the good? Can you give me the contours of what something like that might be?
I can give you the contours because it's fairly easy to define, at least loosely, the end point. A group of people who have a set of common beliefs that are virtuous, and virtuous, of course, can mean different things to different people. But first, to take the examples you already adduced, Greek virtue is not exactly the same as Christian virtue, but for the most part, there's a very significant overlap in the way people lead their lives between those two things. There's also significant differences, but both of them are diametrically opposed to what we have now in America between leftist, non-virtue, which is, kind of leftism is the antithesis of virtue. But even aside from leftism, just the general lassitude, decrepitude, and decay of the average American, who, let's be honest, even if he's a Trump voter, probably lacks personal discipline, lacks personal virtue, is obese, smokes weed, does all sorts of things that a Greek would look at and say, you're a waste of a human being, because you rather than you define freedom as license rather than as ordered freedom, the freedom to choose rightly. And so fundamentally, I guess that's what it boils down to. You need to get back to a system where freedom means the freedom to choose rightly. Rightly probably has a 70 or 80% overlap among successful societies. And I think we should take the other 30% from Christianity, but it doesn't have to be that. If I'm being honest, you can have a successful society that's not Christian. I suspect there's more link than a lot of people like to think between successful Western societies and Christianity, but maybe not. It's hard to say. Oh, maybe it's just my chauvinism showing through. I'm my self-dealing. Like I assign all the virtue to the Christians. I mean, that's obviously not the case. There are people who are not virtuous in the sense I'm talking about, who are not Christian. But so we can define that loosely, fairly easily. But to get to that point is, the traditional way is a religious revival. The classic example of that would be Islam. That is, you wake up one morning and everyone's adopted this new religion, and everyone hews to it and has a totally radically different set of tenets, and it conquers large sections of the Eastern world. And yeah, of course, it's true that it was spread in large part through conquest, but that's not all there was to it. Very obviously, that is, this was attractive to people for a variety of reasons. So you could imagine that kind of religious revival. But short of that, the sad fact is that, first of all, America is a huge country with a huge population. So having a kind of sea to sea revival of that type of a decaying empire, there's no historical example of technology and communication. You could imagine such a thing, maybe, I guess. But the people are so divergent. That is, diversity has been imposed on the United States, self-imposed and imposed by the left and our ruling class, in a way that's tremendously destructive and makes it kind of universal renewal difficult. And the simple fact is that renewals of this type, or rebuildings, if you prefer, in some cases, almost always come after catastrophic events.
Mm.
Like the asteroid hits and 95% of the people die, which doesn't sound real fun to me last I checked.
Yeah.
Or like a real pandemic comes along, like a Stephen King, The Stand kind of pandemic, as opposed to COVID, and so the Wuhan plague. I'm not claiming that I have a mechanism like here in this envelope. Once I unseal it, we'll have the mechanism for this renewal that I recommend. Here you go.
Mm.
I mean, I wish I did, but I don't.
Mm. Uh, okay, so there's no obvious mechanism. It's not prescriptive in that sense, as as a course of action directly. There's some who are more focused on, discrete actions that you could or could not do. There's also Curtis Yarvin's sort of approach, which is similar to yours in some ways, but seems to be more pessimistic and much more defensive. Um, I don't know if you care to comment on Curtis Yarvin's approach or not. It's
Yeah,
up
I
to
think
you.
that's an accurate characterization of Curtis's approach. I mean, I generally like Curtis, though I'm also the author of the most noted hit piece on his philosophy on the internet.
Hmm.
But I mean, I've talked to him, and we're generically speaking friends. I think Yarvin's problem, other than not knowing a ton of history, is that he's too clever by half. He tends
Hmm.
to get himself tied up in philosophical knots, and that leads to this kind of pessimism and also a feeling a little bit of Gnosticism, like I've discovered these secrets that nobody else has. And I think too much philosophy is bad for you.
Hmm.
The Greeks despised philosophers for a reason. We think the Greek philosophers are great, but the actual Greeks despise them.
Hmm.
It- the Oh my gosh, who is the Pericles? If you asked Pericles what he thought of philosophers, he probably would have spat.
Hmm.
He's like, I'm a man of action, a man of the government, the state, and these
Yeah.
philosophers are all a bunch of goobers. He probably would like, throw a bottle at your head or something. So, I mean, I don't think much of excessive amount of philosophizing. I think that the future will be revealed to us, and we have to be ready for what the form of that future will take, rather than saying, well, my study of philosophy has revealed to me what the future form should be. Also,
Hmm.
Yarvin has some kind of uh, ideas that make no sense about corporations and bankruptcies, which are meant to sound like tech bro smart, but really just are kind of dumb. That said, there is a significant amount of overlap in kind of the way we view the future of the world, or
Hmm.
of America. When I
Yeah.
say I talk about the world sometimes, but I primarily mean yeah, America, or in most the Anglosphere.
Hmm. So primarily the importance of a strong executive, as you said, with a government with, what was it, unlimited means but limited ends.
Yes.
Um, so you need something that's strong enough to actually take this large, disparate continent and make those sweeping changes that are required, but would not do so with um, undue licentiousness.
Yeah, I think that's true. There's not a lot of good examples of a successful exercise of something like this.
Hmm.
The typical arc of these things is authoritarianism, the Caesarism, fixing the irresolvable conflicts and debilities of a decaying polity. And everyone also always Roman analogies are overused, but that's obviously one possible example. And there's others. I mean, Napoleon is to a certain extent, and there's others. So, but you don't have to have an authoritarian rule. There's monarchy is not necessarily the best system. You can easily imagine a system with a unified and virtuous ruling class that has a non-monarchical system, or one again. I hate to default to Roman analogies, but the Roman Republic system with consuls for a year, dual consuls with the monarchical element, but only for a limited time. There's
Hmm.
all sorts of possible setups, but they all depend upon not having a cretinous ruling class ruling over a debased set of the masses. The only way to do that latter is poorly is through authoritarianism.
Hmm.
I mean, and even then, it's not likely to be a winning kind of thing.
Yeah, well, this is exactly the problem of freedom without virtue, right? Is that free men, even in uh, by Enlightenment standards, are supposed to be free to the extent that they are self-governing entities.
Mhm.
And freedom is a learned thing. It's the result of education. It's the result of a certain course of action in your life. It's not something that's just granted to you by virtue of being born.
Yeah, and you don't have to go all Calvinist and say man is depraved to see that to see that the people, unless they're confined within a web of obligations and commands and strictures from the society they live in, will far too often tend to descend into lowest common denominator libertinism. I mean, that's a commonplace throughout history.
Yeah. Um, so what is the problem with right-wing elites? Because this is something that, maybe I was a little too naive, but the more I've gotten up close to some of them, and I'm by no means elite myself, the more you realize that the rot and debasement is actually completely thorough. It's not simply that the masses are the problem. It's actually that the entire ruling class itself is equally, if not more, debased than much of the populace. How do you think about that problem, and what do you think about in terms of cultivating a counter elite?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure who you're referring to when you say right-wing elites. I mean, in terms of
Well, elite in quotes.
right. I mean, like in among what I would call the actual elites, the only person who might be considered right wing is Musk,
Hmm.
who of course is on his own arc, and that's a different topic. And right wing elites, it's like being the world's tallest midget. I mean, what the hell? You're Dave Rubin or whatever. I mean, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, or Charles Haywood, who is a micro niche e-celeb, but he has a lot of money, so that makes him slightly more relevant. Anyway, the answer is that the large segments of the ruling class have to be defenestrated.
Hmm.
By defenestrated, I mean, not throwing them out the window, but metaphorically, they have to be taken out of their positions. That said, it's also true that you can, just like you can renew the masses, you can renew the ruling class, even including large segments of the people who are currently in the ruling class. Now, it is true that I think our modern ruling class is probably even more filled with completely irredeemable people, like the Podestas, who are just kind of obviously entirely too close to things like satanic child molestation and with weird kiddie porn in their houses. I mean,
Hmm.
I think it's an awful lot of like bad people who just need to have bad things happen to them when the tribunals are set up. But leaving
Yes.
people like that aside, any ruling class is filled with smart people who are fundamentally opportunists.
Hmm.
And so those people will adopt, can bring something to the table: wealth, power, connections, intelligence, tech lords, but like Mark Zuckerberg, like Mark Zuckerberg, the shit lib, he looks like
Hmm.
maybe he's becoming less of one. You can easily imagine Mark Zuckerberg when, let's say, some Caesar figure comes to town and
Hmm.
says, I'm in charge now. Hey, Zuckerberg, you want to sign up to the new program? Or do you want to
Yeah.
maintain your shit livery? I guarantee you that the new program will be the choice, and that someone like Zuckerberg will endorse it wholeheartedly, and he'll be good
Hmm.
at it. They'll be
Yeah.
fine. Like, I have nothing against Mark. I don't know Mark Zuckerberg. I do know people who know him personally, but yeah, I'd be happy to have Mark Zuckerberg in the new ruling class. He seems like he might have a lot. I mean, Facebook is hell, but he has money. He's young. He can do things. So you can renew the ruling class from within without getting rid of the entire ruling class.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's an important
And
note to make.
I would venture to say that essentially nobody among the kind of right wing elites, today would be part of any new ruling class. I mean, do you think Jordan Peterson, who used to do a bunch of good work before he stopped, he now treats young men as the attracting, pitching his message to young men is the worst possible thing he could do, which is why he's allowed to continue talking and not attacked.
Hmm.
Jordan Peterson is not going to have any rule in some new right wing dispensation. I mean, he just isn't. He's not really. I mean, he may be a fine guy. He clearly has some mental problems and so on. But if you look around, yeah, there's a few people, but the people who would be in a new right wing dispensation in his ruling class, who are not in the current ruling class, are not the people who are who are on the Daily Wire right now.
Well, my position is that the real power players are mostly invisible.
Yes,
People don't know their names.
right. I totally agree. And do you mean that in the sense of they're invisible because they're not currently power players, but might be in the future, or they are power players, but they're not visible to the general public?
Well, both. I think obviously there's going to be younger ones coming up who are not yet well known, but then also the ones who are actually operating currently are not visible to the public. And that's intentional.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, and I certainly hope that's true. I mean, that's very desirable if it's true.
Okay. Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about the books that you choose to review. How do you select what you're going to read?
um, Kind of randomly. I mean, occasionally I get a bee in my bonnet, like about the 1956 Hungarian Revolution or something, and I do keep a stack of books here off to the side that are potential to reads in the future. But I own like physical copies of about 10,000 books,
Wow.
and so honestly, sometimes new books come in and they're topical for some reason or they're written by someone I know. And so I'll review that just kind of de facto. Or for example, today in the mail I received Sean McMeekin's new book. Sean McMeekin wrote Stalin's War and the Russian Revolution. He's a kind of quasi-revisionist Russian historian, Russian and Ottoman. Here's a new book on communism, the rise and fall and rise of communism, which I got in the mail about half an hour ago. So I'll almost certainly read that because I've reviewed 2 or 3 of his books already, and so I also will kind of focus on authors sequentially in that way. I have like 10 Carl Schmitt reviews and 6 or 7 Ernst Junger reviews, things like that. But occasionally I'll just walk down the library halls and pick a book at random. I try not to do things constantly about politics. Those are the most popular, but I make no effort whatsoever to cater to the audience. I don't care what the people want. I mean, if people, yeah, I'm not here for the views or the clicks, whatever, so I'll do things like I was thinking about today about reading a book about John of Gaunt, who is the medieval, the father of Philippa of Lancaster, the mother of Henry the Navigator, but regarded as one of the most powerful non-monarchical English magnates of English history. Of course, English history is over, so that's maybe I should be writing about John of Gaunt. But but if I write about John of Gaunt, yeah, a few people are going to think that's interesting, but I bet I'll get a lot less response than if I write about hot topics of the day. But that's okay. I just feel like so the answer is kind of randomly. I just wake up one morning and decide John of Gaunt is the thing.
Oh, excellent. I like that. You recently did a review of The Days of Rage, America's Radical Underground, the FBI, and the Forgotten Age of Revolutionary Violence. Sort of looking at, the left-wing protest movements and, the violence inherent therein. What was your conclusion about that? You sort of start out by talking about how the revolution that leftists imagine comes from their violent action doesn't ever seem to be the actual result. I'm wondering, like, obviously you've read other things related to that as well, so you have a much broader scope on this than most people. If the cover story for leftist violence is that it leads to that it riles the people into a revolutionary fervor, but that doesn't actually seem to be causal. What is the justification, the true justification in your view for this leftist violence? Is it just resentment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I did not really directly address that in their view what the true justification is. I rather talked about what the inevitable manifestation is. I think the envy is a large part of it. I mean, fundamentally, and I was actually didactically instructing one of my young sons about this yesterday because he asked, not just because I didactically instruct my children, though I do that too. And I was saying that one of the fundamental drivers of the left is envy, the desire for what other people have, because both without having to do the work, but also more broadly, just because other people have it, I want it and they shouldn't have it. So I think that's part of it. But I think the more direct reason for the inevitable leftist turn to violence when they're what they see as achievable is thwarted
Mm,
is because to them, meaning is given by leftism, and the meaning is uh, that they are good people who are working to make a better world and ultimately a utopia. And if people are thwarting that utopia, they are the most evil creatures on the planet, because not only are they thwarting the utopia for people alive today, they're thwarting that utopia for all the generations yet unborn. Leaving aside that leftists, like to kill those later generations, leaving that part aside, it's not going to be as any later generations much longer, as I've been pointing out for some time, and Elon Musk is now in the bandwagon.
mm,
Fundamentally, if you think that that is the core of your being, you yourself working for an achievable utopia, violence is necessarily justified against people who are thwarting that. And I think that's fundamentally why leftists do it, which is somewhat different than the philosophical justification adopted by the 19th century Russian revolutionaries like Bakunin, who originally pushed so-called propaganda of the deed. They had a more philosophical approach to it. But I
mm,
think leftists more generally turn to violence, not necessarily violence calculated to achieve revolutionary fervor, just simple violence. The kind of caveman type, I'm going to hit you on the head because you're not doing what I want kind of thing, because they regard it as necessary in order to achieve an overwhelmingly important goal.
mm. Okay, interesting. And this sort of contrasts with the notion of right-wing violence. One of the things that the left is always sort of preoccupied with and fear-mongering about is right-wing mobs of, nationalists or Proud Boys or whoever, roaming through the streets, I don't know, beating gay people or whatever they're going to do. And it's very interesting to me because, I got very interested in sort of right-wing politics around 2015, 2016, and never really stopped. And one of the things that's interesting is that, like, outside of the really, really, like, frankly, stupid fringes, you don't see a lot of advocacy for especially any kind of street level, non-procedural, non-judicial violence
Mhm.
from the right. And yet this is the constant boogeyman of the left, that the right is like secretly plotting to do these things. And do you think that's all just projection?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is all projection, and it's not just the projection, it's attempt to distract people from what their own intentions are, very kind of deliberately, not just, it's not projection, kind of implies a unknowing or not deliberate refocusing, and it's
Mm,
deliberate refocusing that, because I mean there's no historical examples of this and at all to speak of. I mean, certainly not in the ideological age. The and you say, I'll mention something through my current prism, the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. When the revolution came, the Hungarians had endured 10 years of the most extreme Stalinist repression. Hundreds of thousands of people tortured. I mean, the communists went in very heavily for torture and
mm,
all sorts of just, truly atrocious things. But the amount of people, the secret police, the AVO, who were just summarily executed after the revolution was tiny. And most of them were people who had, like, 5 seconds before, machine gunned a bunch of children in the street, literally. Not
mm,
they were just hunted down because they were secret police. They had literally, like, 5 seconds before, done something to justify summary execution. And
mm,
so what you see instead, the leftists always default to terror. So, for example, again, in the Hungarian context, but you can see this in many other contexts. For example, the 1919 Hungarian Red Terror, after that, or like Francoist Spain, the left always engages in terror, meaning that the killing and torture of people, not because of what they did, but frequently completely randomly, or knowing that they were completely innocent, in
mm,
order to achieve the political end of terror and thereby to accrue power. The right never engages in terror, or almost never. Yeah, there's occasional excesses, but for the most part, and you see this in basically the restoration of order after almost all red terrors, communist terrors, the right goes to considerable lengths to actually figure out who's guilty and
Mm.
punish those people, not just like round up random people on the street and punish them. They actually, sometimes they have what may charitably be called expedited trials, which don't always end up with fair or just results and what have you. So there's that process is not free from abuse and violations of justice of various kinds. But the
Mm.
fact is, the right goes to tremendous efforts in order to punish people who are guilty, not just to create terror as a end in itself. And you see this even in the most extreme kind of ideological right cases. I mean, ideological right regimes are extremely rare, and the only true example is the National Socialist regime, which
Mm.
obviously killed a enormous amount of people, but and so it killed people for kind of quasi-ideological or racial reasons, Jews primarily, but also others. But leaving that aside, when they went around killing communists because they were communists, they like went to great lengths to make sure they were communists, not just like picking random people off the street in the working class areas of the city and killing them. They just
Mm.
didn't go in for that at all. And I mean, like the Gestapo had like 1,000 agents in all of Germany, something tiny number. So I think that the statistic is something like less than 1% of the secret police size of East Germany. So it just wasn't. It's a totally different kind of thing, which doesn't excuse the excesses that you see with that, but all leftists inevitably turn not just to violence, but to terror against random people, partially for the political, but also, and you see this, I'm still trying to work my way through this, as an end in itself. As you see these people just randomly torturing people that they knew personally
Mm.
and knew had done nothing, against the communist state. In fact, in many cases were very devout communists themselves, yet they happily tortured them with the most extreme tortures. Why? Maybe it's something inherent in kind of the degraded nature of the leftist mind, or the whatever attracts the mind to leftism also conduces to things like that. I don't know. I'll have to get back to you on that one.
Yeah, I'm reminded. I recently listened to Martyr Made's one of his long episodes on the Soviet atrocities in Eastern Europe,
Mhm.
particularly in the Ukraine and Romania.
Yep.
And I wasn't as familiar with the full extent uh, of the devastation there and the torture and really the way they just completely brutalized the populations that were under their rule in the immediate post-war years. But it does seem to be like like some sort of sick exercise that is almost satanic in its intent. It does seem to
Yeah.
be that the suffering is the point.
Yeah. And I mean, I can think of extremely few examples, even with the Nazi regime, of torture as an end in itself.
Hmm.
I mean, the only one I can think of is when Hitler had a bunch of people tortured to death fundamentally when they tried to assassinate him. But like the Nazis killed millions of people. That's not good, last I checked. But
Yeah.
they just go in for torture. I mean, yeah, occasionally, and there were various forms of sadism, but things like Schindler's List are largely fiction. This depiction of camp guards and so on and so forth. I mean, they killed all those people, but they just didn't go in for the sadism the left did. That's the kind of projection that you see. I mean, there were cases of it, but just it's ubiquitous in all left regimes and just not in any kind of right regime.
Hmm. And so I want to talk then a little bit about um, what is going on with sort of the right. Um, you know, I think one thing you could say is that there almost seems to be not a real right in a sense in the United States. And what I mean by that is that like the right tradition in the US, especially in the post-war period, is very defined by kind of Cold War conservatism,
Mhm.
which sort of adopts a lot of the liberal presuppositions uh, on its own, and then sort of just stands there, kind of like slowly, like stalling the progression of history, but never actually like changing its fundamental trajectory.
Yeah.
Um, and so I want to ask, you're an American, I'm an American. I have close family ties to Europe. It sounds like you might as well. Are you do you think that there is a real right in America? And then as an addition to that, do you think that there is a real right in Europe? And where, in which continent do you think that it has a better chance, likelihood of resurgence?
It's a good set of questions. So I think there is a real right in America, but it's very nascent. That is, as you say, for many decades, there was no real right. You had, of course, in the interwar period, there was a real right, and it was on the defensive with respect to the New Deal and so on. And World War II put an end to that. And then in the post-war period, you had people like Taft, who were somewhat right, and they were kind of steamrolled by the course of history. That's just the way it was. And then, of course, for decades, you had the Judas William Buckley making sure that there was no actual effective right. That is, the right was only allowed to do things that were accepted by the left and did not hamper the left in any way. To his credit, Buckley was very anti-communist, but on any other and Buckley didn't run the government, so it was anti-communism, had little to say about anything. And on all other matters, he was very careful to make sure anybody who was actually on the right, that is outside the bounds of Enlightenment inflected so-called conservative thought, wasn't allowed to have any seat at the table or to have any prominence. And that was possible, of course, because if you were cast out of what tiny so-called right-wing movement there was with the National Review and a couple other magazines, back in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, you were, even the 90s to a certain extent, you were reduced to mimeographing stuff at your kitchen table and sending it out to a mailing list of subscribers. There was no way to communicate ideas. And the internet as a whole is a net social negative, but it certainly made right-wing ideas much more au courant among wide segments of the population. That doesn't mean that there is a right. And the right is still largely controlled opposition. Again, Jordan Peterson is the best example of this. He used to be a real threat to the regime because he appealed to young men. And then he's now been neutered in some way. I'm not quite sure exactly how. I think his daughter has a lot to do with it. I suspect she's clearly manipulates him for her own benefit. But there is no right in the sense. The right is confined to people who are cutting edge for the 1990s, like the Claremont Institute. I'm a huge fan of the Claremont Institute. I give money to the Claremont Institute. I'm close to and below the Claremont Institute guys. I disagree with them on some things, but they're very right-wing by kind of Buckleyite standards. They're not as right-wing as some other things, and right is a very broad category. And since I take the shortcut and define right as not left, after precisely defining the left, you can fit a lot of room into that. But there is no right that has any power, but there's certainly a nascent right. And that right could very, very rapidly grow because it has a lot of philosophical heft behind it. And under the right circumstances, it could achieve very significant prominence very rapidly. But I think, as you say, the names in that will be newly prominent would mostly be a surprise to us.
And I guess this question of Europe. So from my perspective, Europe has a much deeper philosophical, literary right-wing tradition than the United States, partly just because it's older, but also they weren't sort of as closely subject to the kind of Enlightenment values that America was sort of founded upon. And so my question for you would be like, are you more hopeful of Europe? Do you think that there's a natural affinity towards these ideas that might be stronger on the continent than there is in the United States? Or is it that the United States is the more dynamic society, the richer society, the one that currently controls the internet and therefore has more likelihood to be the birthplace of these ideas, even if we have to borrow them from Europe?
The great set of questions. I'm always saying Europe is over, but what I mean by that is Europe is over because they don't have any children at all. And when you don't have any children at all, not only is that a problem kind of for obvious reasons, basically you don't have any population at all, it means you're a sclerotic society devoted to protecting the old and totally not dynamic. So while it is true philosophically, Europe has a much longer history than America of kind of right-wing belief and behavior. that's useless unless you have children and are dynamic. And by dynamic, I mean you're forcing migrants out at the point of a machine gun.
Mm,
And so you look at someone like Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary. He's not really right wing in any meaningful European sense. I mean, he's kind of a Christian social democrat.
mm,
He's very right wing by modern European standards, which are defined by extreme leftism and desire for endless wars and global homo. So he looks right wing, but like Viktor Orban, like is just some guy. I mean, he says stuff that is completely unexceptional by kind of European or Hungarian political historical standards. It's not like he's Joseph de Maistre reborn. Something.
mm,
I mean, it just so I don't think even the kind of so-called right-wing things happening in Europe aren't really right-wing in any meaningful way. I mean, you have to go back to Salazar in Portugal to see something that's kind of right-wing, and even that is more just kind of corporatist. I mean, maybe Franco, but that's just basically Catholic quasi-monarchy. So I think in theory you can see Europe doing that, but Europe is really going to have to get on the horn if they're going to do anything like that. And there's no evidence whatsoever that Europe is getting on the horn in this regard.
mm,
Whereas in America, and well, certainly wealth is normally antithetical to virtue in a dynamic society. America still has large reserves, large reservoirs is perhaps a better way of putting it, both geographically and again with the internet connected through other methods of people who are young, vibrant, having children, having great ideas, thinking of all these things that they can do. And that ranges from tech bros building stuff in Silicon Valley to the Amish, right?
mm,
There's a huge range of these things. Now, whether or not you can weld an entire empire of these things, I don't know. But the seed bed is more fertile in America, and there's many more seeds that could possibly bring or bear right-wing fruit in a way that just doesn't seem possible in Europe anymore, even if philosophically Europe has more of a tradition of that.
mm,
I'm always touting, and I mean always touting, this book, Fitzpatrick's War.
mm.
I don't know. Did you read my review of that by any chance?
No, I haven't.
But well, Fitzpatrick's War is probably my favorite book of all time.
Mm,
And I'm trying to get it republished, and as well as a sequel and a prequel, which have never been published. But it's by a guy named Theodore Judson, and it costs like $4,000 on Amazon now, unfortunately. But it was published like 20 years ago. But it's a basically a science fiction work, a future history of the United States in the
mm,
26th and 25th centuries, which describes the events of the 21st century, which frankly are kind of eerily predictive over the past 20 years. But Fitzpatrick's War kind of depicts the catastrophic end of the United States and the rebuilding of a new nation from the ashes, in essence. I mean, it is. This book haunts me. Don't get me started on it. We'll be here for hours, so I'm
mm,
not going to even size the plot because it's gonna bore you. But you can see that kind of rebirth of a society just seems much more likely to me than Europe. I mean, Europe is difficult, likely impossible, but not impossible. Europe just seems, and I'm European. I speak Hungarian. I speak some German. I've spent year and a half of my life total in Europe, living in Europe, something
mm,
like that. So a non-trivial amount. My father was a professor of Russian history, spoke all these languages. My mother's Hungarian. I have relatives everywhere in England and Germany and Hungary, and and it just seems like a walking corpse. I
mm.
mean, just I'd like to say that's not true. And every time I put this on Twitter, people are like, "You're a loser. Europe is great. You stupid American." I'm like, well, okay, maybe, but like, what have you done for me lately?
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you a little bit. You've mentioned birth rates now a few times, the sort of fertility crisis. This is apparently still news to people. I'm here in Austin, Texas, and I heard that Richard Dawkins was in town last week and he came in to give a talk. He's doing sort of a
Uh-huh.
farewell tour, and he was apparently unaware that that the depopulation is already occurring in most of the world.
Really?
Yeah, yeah, this is what I hear from people that were at the talk. I was not there myself, so take it with a grain of salt. But um, I spoke to Bennett's phylactery a while ago on the natalism crisis, and he came and hosted the natal conference here last year. They'll
Yeah,
be here
I was there.
again. Yeah, they'll be here again in December. And so this is an interesting point. Do you think that the natalism crisis is recoverable from a cultural perspective, and how much of a threat is this to civilization?
Well, to answer the second part first, it's an existential threat to civilization, which Elon Musk, as I say, is now on this too, and it was actually giving Bennett's phylacteries conference a push several months ago. So that's all great. It's an existential threat, but not just because, like I say, because the population declines and people take you over or you just go extinct, but because it changes the entire way of thinking of the population. And you saw that during the Wuhan plague, where
Mm,
we upended our civilization in order to give decayed old people in nursing homes a few more months of life, and while smashing the lives of the young. Whereas the reality is the old people, you should have made some reasonable efforts to protect the old people, but frankly, it doesn't matter if an old person dies six
you need
months.
we need some actuaries in here to figure out the
Right.
population.
The life of a 6-month-old baby has infinite worth compared to the life of an 85-year-old in a nursing home. Not because human life is relative, but because one is at its end, one is at its beginning. But a
Mm,
society that is aging, especially ours, which is full of disgusting boomers who have spent their whole life ruining our society, engaging in libertine behavior, and now demand that more and more and more be given to them. Ask
mm.
me how I really feel.
Yeah.
So it's an existential threat. There's
Mm,
no, it's a running problem with rich civilizations throughout history, which has never been solved. And it's not going to be solved through like artificial wombs and stuff. If you have to use artificial wombs, that in itself is the sign of a society that can't have children because it thinks in paths that are fundamentally unhuman,
mm,
anti. And so this kind of tech idea that tech is going to solve it is completely insane. What's going to solve it is the old-fashioned ways. Peachy Keenan will tell you all about that in her.
mm,
But the uh, how it can be resolved is not clear at all. It goes back to the renewal question we were talking about earlier, but it is an easier nut to crack than overall societal renewal. Fundamentally, the easiest way to do it would be to stigmatize people who don't have children, both
yeah.
men and women, but particularly women. And the easiest way to do that is to ensure that a woman choosing to have a so-called career is extremely socially stigmatized. That is,
Mm,
you have a career instead of having children. I'm sorry. I don't think we can be friends anymore.
mm,
You have to have extreme social stigma. I mean, basically, and I said this in the natal conference, and people are always bitching about it. Fundamentally, I mean, we should celebrate sex discrimination and very aggressively discriminate against women in the workforce, especially with careers. I mean, unmarried women doing elementary school teaching and things like that, traditional kind of things make a lot of sense. And you have nurses and so on. You have kind of traditional professions and jobs that are feminine for a reason.
mm,
There's no reason whatsoever to have women in general in the workforce doing email jobs. And as everybody knows, and this is a longer conversation, sorry to monologue, 90% of the jobs at any large company are completely worthless.
mm,
Could be, and Musk proved this with Twitter, but I've been saying that for some years. So it's not like our country, people say, oh, the GDP will go down if you, leaving aside that you can't just wave a wand and kick all the women out of the workforce at, Google, say, if you did, it would have no impact whatsoever on Google. In fact, it would make it vastly better because women are detrimental to most businesses in a variety of ways. But I'm sure this should get me in trouble. Anyway, so the only way you're likely to solve the fertility crisis is by completely changing the perception, role, and demands of women in our society.
mm. Yeah. I think that I had conversations for a few years with a group of friends, mostly on Clubhouse, about this exact problem, and the conclusion was that you know women are extremely mimetic, and you need to have we weren't putting it in such stark negative stigmatic terms, but you need to have a strong social pressure and infrastructure around women that encourages them to have
Absolutely. I
children.
don't mean it to be negative. I mean, people I'm pointing out, for example, that there are a couple examples. Can't forget who was doing it on X a while ago, but where social approbation is given to women who have children. And that's just as necessary as stigma. I'm just always
Hmm.
banging on about stigma. I think that's totally right. Is Clubhouse still around, by the way?
No, not really. I mean, it exists. It's functional, but no one's using it. So,
No, sad.
uh,
Anyway, so yes, I totally agree. I mean, but the approbation, the celebration of women who are mothers is crucially important.
yeah. Um, so I also agree with this component of the male's role in all of this, which is like, so I'm in a scene. So I don't have children yet, admittedly. I'm one of the persons who would be, looked down upon until I got around to that. Although I do have a long-term relationship right now, and we're gonna hopefully, God willing, get there very soon. But what I do also see around me a large number of men who feel it's totally acceptable to just continually putting off actually making a serious commitment to any one woman, or if they are committed to one woman, having children with them, basically in order to have fun. I mean, essentially, they're not really doing anything better than that. Most of these men are not titans of industry who are changing the world, and they have some, deep mission that's getting in the way of their family formation. They're kind of just fucking around,
Yeah.
and I think that also should be equally looked down upon, although it tends not to be.
Absolutely. And I mean, those people should get a beat down from other men, basically. I mean,
Hmm.
whether that's physical or not. I mean, but I'm not opposed to physical beat downs of men who, well, it's like, it just, I mean, that's the way people used to handle relationships, social stigma among men, beat downs. So there's something to be said for that. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the idea that a man should delay having children or not have children or what have you. All those things you listed should be just as socially stigmatized. This is not the Andrew Tate Club where Andrew Tate says, whatever Andrew Tate says about how men need to do X, Y, and Z, leaving aside Andrew Tate's other debilities. And
Hmm.
admittedly, I don't watch Tate or know a ton about him, but this is the original conception in all strong societies is of men and women as partners.
Hmm.
And that has both duties, obligations, responsibilities, and rights. And there's really no need to reinvent the wheel. There's been variation, obviously, in societies along these lines, but no successful society has ever had the variation that we have, which is, men screw around and think they have no responsibilities, and women go and get careers. And then, of course, you end up with what we're seeing now in places like South Korea and increasingly here in the United States, huge political divergences between young men and women, where
Hmm.
young women tend to be on the left, young men tend to be on the right. But even those young men on the right frequently are no more willing than men on the left to do what they need to do, or they should be demanded of them in this regard.
Hmm. Yeah, and would you advocate? This is sort of the last question on this. Would you advocate, like, as far as like taxation for particular lifestyle choices? That is, like, almost a regressive tax on people that are unmarried without children.
Oh, absolutely. And nor should it's people like that shouldn't be allowed to vote as well either. I mean, to the
Hmm.
extent anyone's allowed to vote, which is not clear. I mean, this franchise should be sharply restricted.
Yeah.
Anyone who's the more stake you have in society, the more your vote should matter. Which means if you're married, you have more stake. If you have children, you have more stake. If you work for the government, you have less stake, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, people who yeah, I'm all for, whether it's taxation or relief of taxation for people who do things that you want, or taxation of people who do things that you don't want. Those kind of financial incentives are helpful, but it's been proven time and time again that they're grossly inadequate to actually get people to start having children.
Hmm. Right.
The
You need the
Romans tried
cultural.
that and did nothing.
Yeah, you need the whole cultural infrastructure around them.
Yeah, but both. I mean, they're mutually reinforcing.
Hmm. Um, I wanted to ask you a little bit about one individual. I asked you already about Europe, and I already asked you about America a good deal. I want to ask you about Nayib Bukele, who's obviously done a lot of great work in El Salvador, and is kind of like a new type of leader. I believe he's a millennial, probably not much older than myself, and seems to be turning the country around, seems to be revitalizing it. We'll see how careful he is in both not getting himself killed and not being too excessive. But do you think that someone like Bukele would be like a model or a prototype for the kind of change in leadership you would be imagining?
I'm no expert on Bukele, but I do have a lot of friends who are very big fans of his. So certainly my view of him is positive.
Hmm.
But from what I can tell, Bukele is not ideological in any meaningful way. And I'm not even sure he's on the right in any
Hmm.
meaningful way. That is, I think if you asked him, like, do you think X, Y, and Z about enlightenment thought, he might be like, what are you talking about? I have other things to do. Or he might actually endorse kind of leftist ideas. I doubt if he's very philosophically right wing. But at the end of the day, he has bigger problems than that right now, and
Yeah.
we all have bigger problems than that right now. He's much more of a Caesar figure. Caesar is typically not an ideological figure. He's the man. He's an authoritarian reconstructor of a country's institutions, and I certainly uh, think highly of Bukele, and I think that he's the kind of person that who takes those kind of actions could be very useful or desirable in the American context, but he's not a full bore Caesar figure. I mean, he's still the government operates as before. There's a parliament. I mean, it's not like he's taken over the entire country in any meaningful way. He just done the things that are kind of at the outer limits of his power within the existing system that the international order, meaning the regime, tells him he's not allowed to do.
Hmm.
Uh, it's like the people in Georgia, not the state in
Hmm.
America. They're not allowed to have a law that says you have people who take foreign money to influence public policy. You're not allowed to have to report that to the government, even though people go to jail in America all the time for violating the exact same law America has. I mean, it's completely bizarre. So Bukele is clearly doing good work, and he's doing the Lord's work, as they say. So he should clearly be encouraged. I don't know how that's going to work out for him. For example, he's put all these people in prison,
Hmm.
hugely improved the country, which is great. But yeah, I'm not sure what his long-term plan is for that. I mean, these people are not reformable. It's not like he
Yeah.
can let them out. I mean, that's whatever no one wants to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah. That is true, but he does have yeah, very large problems to solve.
I wish him luck.
Yeah. Uh, are you hopeful for the like I guess more rigorous assertion of like US state sovereignty at the state level, as opposed to the federal government? It seems like the federal government, as it gets more incompetent and more dysfunctional, the states do seem to be taking a larger role in determination. Do you think that that might be uh, a reasonable sort of escape hatch for the encroachment of the regime?
Yes and no. It's yes in the sense that that's a traditional way for empires, the center of an empire, to lose power to the periphery. That the provinces simply start doing their own thing, and the central authorities pretends that's not happening, and that it just the process accelerates. I don't think it's likely to happen without any particular crisis coming up. I think right now the federal government is strong enough to largely quell that, though Texas, the federal government backed down in their argument with Abbott several months ago. So I think there's likely to be more and more of that. I certainly hope there's 1,000 times more of that. I mean, I think the states should all completely reject federal authority and free state. I'm not the governor of a state, so but certainly if I was governor of a state, I would do that immediately, given any kind of chance, because I think fundamentally the federal government is unable. I think the federal government is has a large degree of power that it can wield in very narrow areas, but is fundamentally extremely fragile and is unable to do things that it could easily do even 10 years ago. So I would anticipate that ambitious men in the provinces will see that and take advantage of it. And I certainly wish them luck as well.
Hmm. And then one last thing, just before we head out here, you said in that last line that you would hope that ambitious men in the provinces would take sort of take charge of things. You earlier sang the praises of Bronze's Pervert, who we all enjoy, but and I for those publicly watching me later, of course I denounce him, but he is enjoyable. He has sort of advocated that young men form groups of groups that are close knit, where they try to pursue excellence, they try to pursue competence. he is sort of more on the side of like infiltrating institutions than some other people. I tend to more lean on developing outside sort of parallel institutions.
Mhm.
Um, but in both cases, there's this sort of encouragement of a cultivation of highly competent, skilled, articulate, charismatic young men who join together to gain power. Do you do you think that any kind of shift in the regime, I'm not even talking about sort of the how long this might take, is going to come from those groups? And do you have any thoughts or words for any potential ambitious young men who might be listening?
The regime is not going to disappear because of those groups of young men, which I certainly greatly encourage. But the regime is going to disappear, and that right soon, because the regime is completely incapable of withstanding any kind of crisis, any
Mm,
kind of significant crisis. I mean, we're just like again. I keep beating this, but you look at like the communism in the 50s, 60s, 70s. It was run by extremely competent men. You know, the Soviet communism, the satellites. You know, deep thinking, smart, careful, calculating men. I don't like these guys, but they're fascinating to read about because they were just super competent, and they had dealt a not particularly good hand because communism is stupid. But they
mm,
did what they could. Look at our regime. I'm like, it's run by total clowns and idiots, and every so often, the comparison is startling how incompetent and stupid the people who run our present day government are compared to Soviet communism. And
mm,
that strikes people as odd, but it's true. People who ran Soviet communism were vastly more competent than our current government. So very soon, it'd be my prediction. By very soon, I mean before 2030,
oh, wow.
if you have a group of young men like that, it's going to be invaluable. If for no other reason, in your local area, you'll
Mm,
be able to assist in solving problems for your local area. If you're ambitious, you can take political power. You can do all sorts of things with a group of young men. I mean, 98% of history or something has been uh, created by groups of young men, small
mm,
groups, sometimes individuals, but individuals almost always rely on a immediate core group, which is usually you can only learn about by reading the history books because no one ever heard of them. But I have some pieces on my site, like I have one called "My Advice to the Young" and some other things. But fundamentally, if you're a young man, I endorse strongly Bronze Age pervert and his idea of groups of young men seeking excellence. And it
mm.
doesn't really matter. People are always like, well, the feds are going to listen to you. I mean, so what? Like the feds can listen to you all day long. Just don't do stupid stuff, right? I mean,
Yeah,
these
right. Don't
these
become
groups.
terrorists, guys.
Right. I mean, being
Or,
terrorist is, it's like we said earlier, is a complete waste of your time and
mm,
bad and just morally bad to boot. But like seeking excellence together I mean, it's like that meme where there's a meme that circulates occasionally. It shows an FBI agent saying, all they do is talk about growing potatoes and lifting weights. I'm
mm.
so bored.
Yeah, right.
That's what you should be doing
Mm.
but those connections, establishing those connections, that search for excellence is going to be unbelievably important in the years to come.
Excellent. Well, Charles Haywood, The Worthy House, thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you.